So our speaker this evening is Conor Byrne. Conor is currently studying for a PhD at the University of Southampton, has written widely on various historical topics for websites, BBC History, Tudor Life magazine, an expert on Lady Jane Grey, and he's going to talk to us this evening on Mary, Queen of Scots, and Lady Katherine Grey. So this should be interesting. So Conor, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very much for that introduction, and yeah, thank you all for tuning into the talk. I hope you find it really interesting.
I'll just mute everybody now, Conor, right?
Okay, great, thanks. Thank you. Okay.
You are leaving
Conor, you need to unmute.
We need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry about that. So the succession question was arguably the most controversial and politically charged issue of the long reign of Queen Elizabeth I. This was because the succession remained unsettled for 4 decades, with no certainty as to who would succeed, primarily because of both the Queen's decision not to marry and bear children, alongside her reluctance to name a successor. By the mid-1590s, the Jesuit Robert Persons could identify 16 possible heirs to Elizabeth, and in 1601, the lawyer Thomas Wilson named 12 competitors for the throne. During the first decade of Elizabeth's reign, however, 2 leading candidates were in contention for recognition as the Queen's successor in the event of her dying childless: Lady Katherine Grey and Mary, Queen of Scots. Controversy arose as a result of the Queen's father, Henry VIII, barring the Scottish line of his elder sister Margaret, represented in Mary, Queen of Scots, from inheriting the English throne, thus ignoring contemporary customs of primogeniture. In his last will and testament of 1546, he instead nominated the descendants of his younger sister Mary, represented in Katherine Grey, to follow his 3 children in the line of succession in the event of their dying childless. On 30th of December 1546, the king implemented a final revision to his last will and testament, which was signed with a dry stamp. I probably should say, just quickly on a slight sidetrack, that I know with some talks, speakers tend to say quote and unquote when they're quoting, but I think just because I have so many quotes in this talk, I'm not going to do that. So hopefully it makes sense when what I'm saying is a quote from either a primary source or from another author, who I will refer to. So for example, John Edwards has noted that one provision in the 1544 Succession Act later proved crucial: the right of the sovereign to amend the order of succession further in a subsequent will and testament. For this was a move of great constitutional significance, since it meant that the succession was now in effect to be determined not by legitimacy of birth or by hereditary right, but by the will of the sovereign acting under parliamentary statute. Although the illegitimacy of Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, was not overturned in his last will and testament, the king decreed that they could in turn succeed their brother Edward if the latter died without siring heirs. If both Mary and Elizabeth also died childless, then the crown shall wholly remain and come to the heirs of the body of the Lady Frances Brandon, our niece, eldest daughter to our late sister, the French Queen, Mary Tudor, lawfully begotten, and then to the heirs of the body of the Lady Eleanor Brandon, our niece, second daughter to our said late sister, the French Queen, lawfully begotten. According to contemporary hereditary and dynastic succession customs, Mary, Queen of Scots, granddaughter of the king's elder sister, Margaret, should have had precedence over Lady Jane Grey and her sisters, but Henry VIII ignored existing beliefs about primogeniture in royal succession. Historians have puzzled over Henry's reasons for excluding the descendants of his elder sister, the Scottish line, from the line of succession in favour of those of his younger sister, but undoubtedly the king had no reason to believe that all 3 of his children would in turn die childless, thus creating a succession controversy during the second half of the 16th century. In an attempt to resolve the succession question during the early years of Elizabeth I's reign, a number of tracts were produced during the 1560s seeking to identify the candidate with the strongest claim as part of an attempt to compel the Queen to nominate her successor. During this decade, Elizabeth's councillors pressed the still young Queen to marry and produce an heir, but they also acknowledged that until such time that she did so, it was essential to recognise an heir presumptive to ensure dynastic and political stability. Katherine and Mary were dynastic competitors during the 1560s, and both women attracted support for their claims, while arguments for their exclusions were also proffered by contemporary writers. While ultimately the succession tracts failed to persuade either Elizabeth or her Privy Council to nominate a successor, they shed light on the means by which authors sought to create support for a particular claimant based on their reading of existing inheritance customs, succession precedents, and the role played by religious affiliation and nationality. And as mentioned earlier, this talk will investigate the claims presented in the 1560 succession tracts on behalf of Katherine and Mary as their authors attempted to settle the succession in a climate of dynastic uncertainty. Before proceeding to an analysis of the succession tracts and the early Elizabethan succession question, it is useful to establish brief biographical context for both women and their places in the succession question. Katherine, born in August 1540, was the second daughter of Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and Frances Brandon, who was the daughter of Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary, formerly Queen Consort of France, and subsequently Duchess of Suffolk as the wife of Charles Brandon. Thus, Katherine was a great-granddaughter of the first Tudor king, Henry VII. By contrast, Mary, born in December 1542, was the only surviving child of James V of Scotland and Mary of Guise, and was a granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, elder sister of Henry VIII. Thus, like Katherine, Mary was a great-granddaughter of Henry VII. But while Mary became Queen of Scots at 6 days old and Queen Consort of France in 1559 as wife of Francois II, Katherine is perhaps best known as the younger sister of the ill-fated Lady Jane Grey, the so-called 9 Days Queen. In 1553, she married Henry Herbert, heir to the earldom of Pembroke, although this marriage was later annulled following the collapse of Jane's regime and accession of Mary I. Katherine's succession rights, enshrined in Henry VIII's last will and testament, were confirmed by Edward VI's device for the succession of 1553, in which he barred both of his elder sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, from the succession on the grounds of their illegitimacy, and instead nominated Jane Grey and her male heirs as his successors. If Jane were to prove childless, then Katherine was, according to the device, her sister's heir. The device laid out Edward's wishes as follows: for lack of issue male of my body, to the Lady Frances as heir males, if she have any of such issue before my death, to the Lady Jane and her heir males, which was later amended, which had previously been to the Lady Jane's heir males, but recognising that Jane wasn't going to bear a son before he died, Edward amended it so that she too would inherit. To the Lady Catherine's heir males, to the Lady Mary's heir males, to the heir males of the daughters which she shall have hereafter, then to the Lady Margaret's, this is the Grey sister's cousin Margaret Clifford, heir males, for lack of such issue to the males of the Lady Catherine's daughters, and so forth till you come to the Lady Margaret's daughters' heirs males. So very convoluted. Following his death on 6th of July 1553, Jane succeeded him as queen, and her proclamation asserted that for lack of such heir male of our body lawfully begotten, that then the said imperial crown and all other the premises should remain, come and be to the said Lady Katherine, our said second sister, and to the heir males of the body of the said Lady Katherine lawfully begotten, with divers other remainders, as by the same letters patents more plainly and at large it may and doth appear. During the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI, therefore, Katherine's claim to the throne was explicitly upheld, even if neither king realistically expected her or her heirs to inherit the crown. Despite her dynastic significance, prior to Elizabeth I's reign, Katherine's presence in the contemporary records is fragmentary. After 1558, however, the year of Elizabeth's accession, she became a subject of national and international interest in view of her claim to succeed Elizabeth should the Queen die childless. The possibility of Katherine becoming Queen was significant in view of the bearing her succession would have on the English religious settlement. To Elizabeth's Protestant councillors, including her chief advisor Sir William Cecil, Katherine was the most viable successor, whereas Mary, Queen of Scots, received Catholic support. With regard to Elizabeth's first decade as Queen, Mortimer Levine has suggested that the early Elizabethan succession question was above all a question of whether the next wearer of the crown should come from the line of Stuart or that of Suffolk. For that reason, at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, the imperial ambassador made overtures to Catherine because of Spanish antipathy to the prospect of the French king's daughter-in-law, Mary, Queen of Scots, becoming Queen of England. Indeed, following Mary I's death, Mary, Queen of Scots, publicly proclaimed herself the legitimate Queen of England in what was a withering dismissal of Elizabeth's succession to the throne. The royal arms of the Scottish Queen and her husband, the Dauphin Francois, son of Henri II of France, were quartered with those of England. This aggressive act of asserting Mary's claim to the English throne would only have strengthened support for Catherine's succession rights among Elizabeth's Protestant councillors. In doing so, Mary explicitly ignored the provisions of Henry VIII's last will and testament, and instead asserted her right to inherit the throne according to primogeniture. While Mary's claim to succeed Elizabeth may have been stronger by right of heredity, the Grey claim was likely favoured by the English political elite because it promised, as Susan Doran has noted, to continue a clear and unchallenged Protestant line of succession to the English throne. The Count of Feria, then serving as ambassador at the English court, reported to Philip II of Spain in March 1559 that Lady Katherine, who is a friend of mine and speaks confidentially to me, told me that the Queen Elizabeth does not wish her to succeed in case of her Elizabeth's death without heirs. She is dissatisfied and much offended at this, and that the Queen's only making her one of the ladies of the presence, whereas she was in the privy chamber of the late Queen Mary I, who showed her much favour. The present Queen probably bears her no goodwill. Whether or not Elizabeth had grounds for her dislike of Catherine, the latter certainly had every reason to resent the Queen's attitude towards her. From Elizabeth's perspective, however, she evidently had no desire to be seen to favour Catherine as her heir presumptive, given that she had not yet reached a decision on the question of her marriage, the most important issue confronting her at the beginning of her reign. Although Elizabeth has long been identified and celebrated as the Virgin Queen, the belief that she viewed herself as such from the beginning of her queenship is a misapprehension deriving from a retrospective view of the reign. The evidence does not support the traditional belief that Elizabeth consciously decided at the beginning of her reign not to marry, whether because she was opposed to marriage or because she was determined to rule alone. This is an assumption based on William Camden's version of her speech to the 1559 Parliament, but documents dating from Elizabeth's reign do not support this account of her speech. As in her predecessor Mary's reign, it was taken for granted by Elizabeth's statesmen that she would marry in order to produce an heir, especially given contemporary ambivalence, if not hostility, to female monarchy. Elizabeth's contemporaries unanimously agreed that it was her duty to marry and produce an heir to continue the Tudor dynasty. Indeed, Ilona Bell has argued that Parliament's repeated petitions during Elizabeth's reign to persuade her to marry can be interpreted as an effort to fulfil its fundamental patriarchal responsibility to preserve the social order by securing a husband for the Queen and an heir to the crown. However, the choice of husband was a more controversial issue, especially in view of the tumult caused by Mary I's selection of Philip of Spain as her spouse. Until such time that the Queen married and produced an heir, the succession question remained unresolved. Feria further confided that I tried to keep Lady Catherine very friendly, and she has promised me not to change her religion, nor to marry without my consent. Catherine received Spanish support when she apparently promised the imperial ambassador that she would adhere to the Catholic faith and would be receptive to marriage with a member of the House of Habsburg. Around this time, a marriage between Catherine and James Hamilton, 3rd Earl of Arran, a descendant of James II of Scotland, was also rumoured as a means of uniting the heir apparent of England with the heir apparent of Scotland. These mooted marriages testify to international awareness of Catherine's royal blood and claim to inherit the throne according to Henry VIII's last will and testament in the event of the Queen dying childless. Both Elizabeth's councillors and the imperial ambassador and his master were unaware that Catherine was then involved in a clandestine liaison with Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, and the couple secretly married in late 1560. While they initially sought to conceal their relationship, when Catherine became pregnant, Elizabeth's discovery of their union was inevitable, and both parties were incarcerated in the Tower, since the Treason Act of 1536 had made it a treasonable offence to marry or deflower a member of the royal family without the monarch's permission. An ecclesiastical commission declared the marriage invalid, and their two sons, born in 1561 and 1563 respectively, illegitimate. Catherine and Hertford were placed under house arrest and never saw one another again. Living far from court, during the succession debates of the 1560s, Catherine was little more than a cipher. In an audience with William Maitland of Leathington, ambassador of Mary, Queen of Scots, in September 1561, Elizabeth explained that she abhorred to draw in question the title of the crown. So many disputes have been already touching it in the mouths of men. When I am dead, they shall succeed that has most right. During the 1560s, those disputes were to continue unabated, especially in the medium of succession tracts, and gathered momentum as a result of a number of developments, including the Queen falling ill with smallpox in 1562, which led to rumours of her imminent death and plunged the succession into crisis in view of its unsettled state. The succession tracts warned of the dangers of failing to nominate a successor, for example, by looking back to the civil wars of the 15th century, involving bloody battles that were of long time, and thus emphasised the importance of establishing the Queen's successor, because it shall be for the benefit of the whole Commonwealth. The tracts variously identified either Catherine or Mary, Queen of Scots, as the candidate with the strongest claim to be Elizabeth's successor. The Scottish Queen herself is quoted as having viewed Catherine herself as her competitor. Those who favoured Catherine's claim based their support on Henry VIII's last will and testament, backed by parliamentary statute, which named as heirs the descendants of his younger sister Mary, the Suffolk line, in the event of his own 3 children dying childless. Some councillors, however, argued that Henry's will was fraudulent, as it had not been signed with the king's own hand, but instead endorsed with a dry stamp, thus barring Catherine from succeeding. Levine suggested that who possessed the prior right to the succession was dependent upon whether or not the will of Henry VIII was valid. The anti-Suffolk succession tracts alleged that the will had to have been signed with the king's own hand in order for it to be valid, and claimed that the will had merely been stamped after Henry's death rather than having been signed by him. Maitland viewed the king's will as a dissembled and forged signed testament, and argued that the publishing of so many exemplifications of King Henry's supposed will were not of so great force in law as to serve for the recovery of anything either real or personal. However, if, as Catherine's supporters believed, the king's will was authentic, then Catherine had the best claim to succeed Elizabeth. Additionally, both those who favoured and rejected Catherine's claim considered whether the marriage between her grandparents, Charles Brandon and Mary Tudor, Duke and Duchess of Suffolk, was valid in terms of whether the Duke had acquired an annulment of his earlier marriage to Margaret Mortimer. The MP John Hales claimed that Brandon had obtained an annulment on the grounds of his pre-contract to Anne Brown, whereas supporters of Mary, Queen of Scots, argued that he had not been pre-contracted to Anne, nor had he had carnal copulation with her at the time of marrying Margaret. However, Pope Clement VII had issued a bull affirming that Brandon had obtained an annulment from Margaret on the grounds of affinity and consanguinity by the Archdeacon of London, and also held that Brandon's children, both with Anne Brown and Mary Tudor, were legitimate. Towards the end of the 1563 Parliament session, John Hales wrote and circulated a tract entitled A Declaration of the Succession of the Crown Imperial of England. He argued that according to the will of Henry VIII, Catherine, who was described by historian Victorien de la Torre as the leading Protestant claimant, was Elizabeth's successor. Her claim was legally binding, given that the king's will had been enacted into law. A declaration, more than any of the other succession tracts in circulation during the 1560s, went the furthest in arguing for the legality of Catherine's claim to succeed Elizabeth, endorsing it according to Henry VIII's will and the common laws of this realm. Hales criticised the findings of the Ecclesiastical Commission of 1562 that Catherine's marriage to Hertford was invalid, and instead proclaimed its validity in line with the law of God's law and the common law, Catherine's uncle Lord John Grey, and Hales both having sent Robert Beale abroad to consult learned men in Europe about the marriage. In his tract, Hales also argued that foreigners, namely Mary, Queen of Scots, and her heirs, were barred by common law from succeeding to the English throne. Hales and other opponents of Mary maintained that she could not succeed Elizabeth because she was Scottish and thus an alien, English law stipulating that a foreigner, or person born out of allegiance to the English monarch, could not inherit property within the realm. As Hales explained, the Scottish Queen is not the King of England's child, nor was born in the King of England's allegiance, nor yet come of father and mother in the faith and allegiance of the King of England, nor is a free woman in England, and so by law she cannot inherit in this realm. Thus the Scottish Queen can make justly, by the laws of England, no claim to the crown, wherefore, because she hath no right in law nor reason. Hales put forward evidence to demonstrate that Henry VIII had made a will according to the statute, thus barring all others from succeeding. And Hales rejected attempts to discredit Henry's will by arguing that King Henry made a will, since it appeareth by the testimony and subscription of the 16 witnesses that it was signed with his own hand, since it was so preferred by the executors, since it was as his will enrolled in the Chancery and published under the Great Seal of England, wherein it was written that it was signed with his own hand, since the particle and the record thereof without order be destroyed, and all the other wills burnt, and since there can come forth no such witness to disprove it as the law admitteth. In addition, Hales viewed the rumour that Charles Brandon had been married to Margaret Mortimer when he wed Mary Tudor as a mere slander, growing altogether upon malice, and acknowledged that even if it were true, it had no bearing on Catherine's place in the succession, for it concerned only the legitimacy of Charles's daughters, Frances and Eleanor, neither of whom were named in Henry VIII's will as possible successors. Hales believed that both of Charles's daughters were born in lawful matrimony, and as a result, Catherine was Elizabeth's heir presumptive, both by King Henry, his will, and also by the common laws of this realm. When the Queen learned of Hales' tract, she ordered him to be committed to the Fleet prison for his boldness, and her fury was motivated in part by her fear that the tract endangered her plan for Mary to wed Elizabeth's favourite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, alongside worsening Elizabeth's relations with the Scottish Queen. Another tract, the allegations against the surmised title of the Queen of Scots and the favourers of the same of 1565, rejected Mary's claim on the grounds that she was an alien, while warning of the dangers of subjecting England to foreign rule. In addition, the Scots were a people by custom and almost nature our enemies, thirsty of our blood, poor and miserable by their country, and envious of our welfare. The allegations warned of servitude and bondage experienced under foreign rule, as well as subjection. Mary's claim would be strongest if Scotland could be considered as being subject to England, and if there was no other person that had better title by statute or else by the will of King Henry VIII, then by being next of blood, she would enjoy a superior claim. The tract also refuted the suggestion that Mary's marriage that year to Henry Lord Darnley, who was, like Mary, a grandchild of Margaret Tudor, strengthened her claim to be Elizabeth's successor. That by the marriage to the Lord Darnley, the Queen of Scots title was no way bettered. By contrast, the following year, 1566, the lawyer Edmund Plowden wrote, "A treatise proving the Queen of Scots by her birth is not disabled by the law of England to receive the crown of England in response to Hales's tract." Plowden denied that Edward III's 1351 statute prohibiting aliens from inheriting in England applied to the succession. While the inheritance rule and the statute applied to bodies natural, it did not apply to the crown, the body politic, and the succession. Similarly, Bishop John Leslie claimed that the crown was a corporation, and therefore it doth not descend according to the common course of private inheritance, but goeth by succession as other corporations do. Mary's supporters also questioned whether Henry VIII's will was valid. If it was not, then the Scottish Queen arguably enjoyed a stronger claim than Catherine to succeed Elizabeth. An anonymous tract of 1566, perhaps Plowden's, held that the king's will was invalid because it was not signed by dry stamp and not with his most gracious hand, and thus that if his will in writing be not signed with his hand, it is insufficient to make the crown pass. The authority of the act is not executed, and so the limitation of the crown by that will is void. Yet none of the authors of the tracts had ever seen the original document, as it was kept concealed. Another strategy was adopted by authors in their attempts to designate the Queen's successor. While Catherine's supporters, including Hales, denied allegations of her illegitimacy, those who regarded Mary as Elizabeth's lawful successor argued that Catherine was illegitimate and as such was barred from the succession. The anonymous author of the allegations in behalf of the high and mighty princess, the Lady Mary, now Queen of Scots, touching the succession of the crown, written in 1565, claimed that Charles Brandon had then another wife living, Margaret Mortimer, when he married Mary Tudor, and thus had lived with Mary in adultery. As a result, Catherine, being come of one not legitimately born, cannot inherit or be capable of the crown. Charles's marriage to Margaret meant that his union with Mary was void, and so all the issues clearly bastard. and as a result of her illegitimacy, Catherine could not succeed to the crown, because for the honour and dignity of the realm, whosoever should be worthy or capable of the crown, it is meet that not only they should be free from any stain or spot, but also from all suspicion of any. Catherine's supporters countered such claims by noting that even if Charles's daughters by Mary were illegitimate, this would not overturn Catherine's title by Henry VIII's will, which assigned the succession not to Francis but to her heirs. Perhaps aware of this counter-argument, the allegations alluded to recent events in England in asserting that Catherine was also disqualified from the succession as a result of her great wickedness and whoredom, for which she hath deserved grievous punishment, namely falling into carnal company with Hertford, despite already being lawfully married to Herbert. She, the wife of one man, did give her body to be used of another man unlawfully. Her unlawful marriage meant that she had cut off all hope of having lawful issue by her to succeed and possess the crown hereafter. Finally, in Mary I's reign, it had been rumoured that both Katherine and Mary Grey were disqualified from the succession as a result of their sister Jane's conviction and execution for treason. Her sisters likewise, being themselves reproached with the same crime, are consequently excluded from the succession. Despite the proliferation of tracts during the 1560s, contemporaries failed to reach a consensus on the matter of the Queen's successor. In October 1566, law students at Lincoln's Inn held a disputation on the succession, finding that Mary, as an alien, could not legally succeed to the crown, even if she were the nearest in birth and the ablest. As Maitland noted, the disputation ruled against the Queen, my sovereign. This event was intended to influence the proceedings of the upcoming Parliament. A pamphlet entitled A Common Cry of Englishmen circulated at the same time and beseeched the Queen to settle the succession question in Parliament to prevent the certain ruin and destruction of the realm. It reads as follows: "We speak not of any private matter, but of that which greatly toucheth us all, and you with us all. We say high and low, if you, O Queen, do die, void of issue and wanting a known successor, as the case now standeth, what good can continue? What evil shall not come? It is not your marriage, most noble Queen, which can help this mischief, for a certain ruin cannot be stayed by an uncertain means. It is uncertain whether you shall marry. It is uncertain whether you shall have issue in your marriage. It is uncertain whether your issue shall live to succeed you. But this is most certain, that unless the succession after you be, and that in time appointed and ordered, England runneth to certain ruin and destruction. And this is what we most humbly beg for England's sake, without verily it may be doubted whether England will long be England. That is, that you with your High Court of Parliament do both appoint your next successors and also the succession and the inheritance in safe and sure order." On 26th of October, the Imperial Ambassador Diego Guzman de Silva reported that the succession was still being discussed in Parliament, and that Elizabeth is extremely annoyed as she fears that if the matter is carried further, they will adopt Catherine, both she and her husband, the Earl of Hertford, being strong Protestants, and most of the members of the Parliament are heretics and are going on that course to maintain their own party. For the supporters of Mary, Queen of Scots, however, her claim had arguably been strengthened that year as a result of the birth of a son, James, the future James I of England, alongside the disgrace of both Catherine and her younger sister Mary Grey, who had similarly undergone a clandestine marriage and suffered house arrest. Notwithstanding this, de Silva was to claim that it would be much better for the Queen of Scotland that it, meaning Parliament, should be dissolved, as the members of the Commons are, as I have said, nearly all heretics and adherents of Catherine, and noted that there was an artful plot in favour of Catherine. The Queen dissolved Parliament on 2nd of January 1567 without resolving the succession question. Maitland expressed the belief that by the civil and common laws and by the common laws of England, Mary was undoubtedly heir to the crown next after the issue of Henry VIII, lawfully begotten, but noted that the books and writings containing any discussion of titles had influenced public opinion to the extent that there was now a settled opinion against my sovereign, Mary, to the advancement of the Lady Katherine's title. The following month, Lord Darnley was murdered in Edinburgh, and the scandal of his death was amplified by the suspicion of his wife's involvement. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, decided to offer his support for Catherine's claim to the succession as a result of the scandal surrounding Mary, Queen of Scots. De Silva related that on the night that the King of Scotland's death was known, here Lord Robert sent his brother, the Earl of Warwick, to the Earl of Hertford, Catherine's husband, to offer him his services in the matter of succession. And Lord Robert himself went to see the Duchess of Somerset, the Earl's mother, with the same object, and had made friends with both of them, contrary to his former action, as he has shown signs of a desire to help the Queen of Scotland. Although she remained in disgrace, the events of 1567 were generally perceived to improve Catherine's succession prospects as a result of a decline in the Scottish Queen's fortunes. At court, the heretics, including Catherine's supporters, openly voiced the opinion that Mary had been involved in her husband's death, in revenge for her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, whose murder Darnley had been implicated in the previous year. Although Elizabeth cannot believe the Queen of Scotland could be to blame for so dreadful a thing, notwithstanding the murmurs of the people, allegations of Mary's complicity were rumoured to be set afloat by people who desired to injure her and make her odious in this country in respect to the succession, and Elizabeth was advised to be on the alert to prevent undue elation of the opposite party, who was strong and might cause trouble, meaning that of Katherine Grey. Elizabeth shrewdly took this advice and showed no sign of forgiving Catherine, let alone naming her as her heir presumptive in the wake of the Scottish Queen's fall from grace. The conditions of Hertford's incarceration were made stricter, since, according to De Silva, they are possibly aware of some movement in his interest, as I am assured that certain negotiations are afoot respecting the succession to the crown. In January 1568, Catherine died at the age of 27, perhaps of consumption, and the focus of her supporters turned to her eldest son, Edward Lord Beauchamp. Catherine's untimely death could have had the effect of clarifying and indeed strengthening the claim of Mary, Queen of Scots, to succeed Elizabeth as Queen. However, Catherine's death occurred only months after Mary's abduction and possible rape, historians dispute this, by the Earl of Bothwell, subsequent marriage to him, and her enforced abdication and imprisonment at Lochleven Castle. In May 1568, the deposed Queen made the ultimately fatal decision to escape from the castle and seek assistance in England. As is well known, during her captivity, Mary's reputed involvement in treasonous conspiracies that aimed to depose her and replace Elizabeth led to her condemnation and execution in 1587, the fourth Queen in the 16th century to suffer beheading for treason. The succession remained unsettled for the remainder of Elizabeth's reign, and by the 1580s and 1590s, the Privy Council adopted a policy that sought to suppress public discussion and, where possible, manuscript circulation relating to the succession. By 1581, the publication of books regarded as seditious became a felony. Ultimately, Elizabeth ignored her father's last will and testament by refusing to recognise Catherine's eldest son, Edward, as her successor. Instead, on her death in 1603, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, only son of the disgraced Mary, Queen of Scots. His accession to the English throne was not predestined. Even Elizabeth's supposed recognition of him on her deathbed as her heir is open to question. As John Guy has observed, the suggestion of the English Queen's recognition of the Scottish King in her dying hours is not supported by solid evidence, and as she had by then lost the power of speech, the most she might have done was to signal her assent by a gesture. Even that is guesswork. The seeming inevitability of James's inheritance of the English throne has served to marginalise the arguable superiority of Catherine's claim to succeed Elizabeth, a claim which was recognised in a number of succession tracts produced during the 1560s that sought to persuade the still unmarried Queen to nominate a successor for the stability of her realm. These tracts grappled with the question of whether Henry VIII's last will and testament, which had been enacted into parliamentary statute, overturned hereditary descent and primogeniture, and those who believed it had, including John Hales, ruled that as to the next of blood, and true and just heir by our laws, the crown ought to descend presently to the Lady Katherine. Thank you. Thanks.
Excellent. Well done. That was very interesting. There's lots of interesting things there. Some things I didn't know about, actually. But my first question is, I've seen Katherine written with a K or a C? Which do you think is the best?
Yeah, that is a good question, because in the sources, both K and C do tend to be used, but
Yes.
I think this kind of applies to Henry VIII's 3 wives, who were also called Catherine.
Catherine of
K does seem,
Aragon is another example.
yeah, I think, yeah, with the contemporary sources, K does seem to be the most widely used. But as I'm sure you all know, there was no kind of standardization of spelling in the 16th century. So her name was spelt in an array of different ways. K just seems to have been the commonality, which is why I've gone for it.
Yes, interesting. Right. Well, there were lots of interesting things there. What struck me was that there were so many important women during that period. You have Mary the First, of course, who was the first queen regnant, and quite a remarkable queen in her own right, in my view, and the view of many people as well. Then you've got, of course, Lady Jane Grey, with her claim to the throne, unfortunate result of that one. And then, of course, you've got Elizabeth, who some people think, Tracy Borman, for example, seems to be of the opinion that she's our greatest queen and all that sort of thing. I personally don't share the view myself, but there are many who do. There are lots of reasons for that. And then, of course, you've got Mary, Queen of Scots, who was very unfortunate and made a lot of poor decisions, or was listening to the wrong people, probably, unwise marriages and relationships and things, and saying and doing things which were deemed to be treasonous by Elizabeth, which was not a great idea to commit treason in those days. It was not commended generally. So there were a lot of very powerful women, and that's a fascinating thing, because it's one of the, this period of history has, these women who are playing starring roles in the history books, really, at the time. It's quite amazing.
Definitely, yeah.
Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart, of course, was Catholic, so that had a major influence on events and results and so forth. So there's an awful lot of interesting things. Of course, the attitude to Mary, Queen of Scots, was that she was alien and foreign, being Scottish, which is a strange idea for us, of course, because we're the same country now. But in those days, we weren't, and a lot of people not kind of fully aware of that Scotland was a separate kingdom with its own laws and customs and traditions and royal family and so on. But eventually, of course, they become intermarried, don't they? So it's strange that Mary, Queen of Scots' son becomes James I. Kind of ironic, really. So
it is, yeah, very
ironic. Now, I'm trying to see whether I can see the chat, actually, because I can't actually see the chat where I am at the minute, and I don't know why. So I don't know whether anybody else can actually see the chat. So I don't know why it is. It's
I can see that one question's come through, so I think it's coming through for me.
Okay, would you like to have a look at that, because I can't actually see the chat.
Sure. So the first question, which I think that's from Lynn, I want to say, from the English Catholic History Association. What happened to Catherine's son Edward? That is a very interesting question, and I do address this in the book, which bit of shameless publicity there. So there's no real sense that he himself had any interest in staking a claim to the succession, whereas his younger brother Thomas, who actually predeceased Elizabeth, made repeated attempts to have the legitimacy of his parents confirmed, and actually got in quite a lot of trouble with Elizabeth during the 1590s for doing so, because it meant challenging the verdict that had been reached according to her own desires. Edward Seymour made a marriage to Honora Rogers, which proved quite controversial with Catherine's husband, the Earl of Hertford. And there's quite a lot of evidence that he kind of made repeated attempts to desist his son from marrying Honora, because she was of lesser social status, and there's a sense that Hertford himself continued to harbour some ambition for the succession, and his son Edward's match with Honora kind of weakened his claim, so to speak. But compared to James VI of Scotland, who, as is well known during the 1590s, was in constant communication with William and then Robert Cecil about the English succession, who harboured personal ambitions to be recognised as Elizabeth's successor. There is no real evidence that Edward Seymour had this kind of desire. Whereas, as I said, his younger brother had, it seems, more of an interest in being regarded as legitimate, perhaps with a view to his succession rights being upheld. So hopefully that makes sense. But it was actually only during the reign of James I, somewhat ironically, that the Hertford Grey marriage was confirmed as legitimate, perhaps because by this time James was firmly secure on his throne and didn't regard Catherine's descendants as any kind of threat to his kingship, if that makes sense.
It seems to be in Elizabeth who saw others as threats to her, but James was secure once he got into the throne. He was secure, and he didn't really care, I don't suppose.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, there's been an argument made that Elizabeth personally disliked all of the Greys, especially Katherine Grey, for whatever reason. And I don't think there's necessarily enough evidence to support this, because if you look at Elizabeth's treatment of a number of candidates with claims to the throne, including obviously Mary, Queen of Scots, but even the Greys' cousin Margaret, Lady Strange, who was accused of involvement in sorcery and predicting how long Elizabeth would die, because she believed that she had a claim to be recognised as Elizabeth's successor if all three of the Grey sisters were illegitimate. So I think this attitude is seen with Elizabeth with regard to a number of members of the royal family, not just Catherine. But definitely, yeah, her kind of hostility showed no sign of abating, even when it became clear that, that Catherine herself, and again, this is something I mentioned in the book, seems to have had no personal interest in being regarded as her successor, especially by the kind of end of her life. Yeah.
Elizabeth was particularly spiteful, it seems, towards Katherine Grey. I mean, when she had a baby in the Tower and without permission or something, and then got sent somewhere else after the birth of the second child, I think. And her husband was separated miles away, so there was no possibility of a third child. It was it just seemed to be very, very spiteful. It just reveals more about Elizabeth's character. I mean, her treatment of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the treatment of Katherine Grey just tells you an awful lot about the psyche of the woman, really, and her the way she treated anybody who was in any way a rival or for whatever reason disliked. She seemed to be a very, very beautiful person. So for people like Tracy Borman to say she was a great queen, I think, yeah, but she was awfully spiteful and to an awful lot of people, including family and friends.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Yeah, one of the chapters of the book is devoted entirely to Catherine's disgrace, and it looks a lot at these succession tracks as well. And as part of the research, involved looking at a succession of letters written both by Catherine and by her uncle, Lord John Grey, with whom she says she was in house arrest, but she was in a number of different properties, and only one of which was with him. But he wrote on her behalf, in addition to her sending letters to William Cecil, and they tried to intercede with Robert Dudley as well, Elizabeth's favourite. And, just reading these letters, you can really see, I think, as the months pass, Catherine's just mental state deteriorating, and her uncle saying that, she was refusing to leave her bed. It is thought that she died of consumption, but some historians have suggested, I think it's a bit inconclusive, but suggested that she maybe starved herself to death. So definitely a suggestion that, she had what we would call depression. And yeah, as I'm, sure all of you will know with Mary, Queen of Scots, and kind of seeing it from that side. part of the PhD research, because Mary is one of my central figures, involves looking at a lot of martyrologies and a lot of Catholic sources, and definitely Elizabeth, as you would expect, is portrayed in a very different light, and instead her, as you say, cruelty, vengeance is very much emphasised. So yeah, I think that it's very open to debate whether she was the greatest queen, because I think it really depends, whether this is slightly going off topic, but whether you could even say that Mary, could be guilty of committing treason when she was, an anointed monarch of a foreign nation. So yeah, but that's obviously something that can be debated in and of itself. So
it's sometimes difficult to separate the fact from fiction when the victors write the history and put their own spin on things, which certainly happened a lot during the reign of Elizabeth and following the reign of Elizabeth. Particularly, for example, when they were particularly nasty to Mary, to Queen Mary, and made out all sorts of things about her. And the same thing with a lot of these people, that the spin is put on them by propagandists, because that's no other word for them, propagandists. So we never really know. It's very difficult to tell, even looking at sources and things, because how much bias is there? A lot of intentional bias by a lot of the people who wrote about these events. So it's very difficult to actually know actually what they were really like. But I would say that Elizabeth was one of the nastiest pieces of work one could imagine, really, the way she treated, 200 Catholics dead, for example, and something like 160 of them priests, I think, and things like this. And an awful lot of other people tortured, imprisoned, and, her own cousin executed. I mean, she wasn't a very nice piece of work, and I wouldn't want to meet her myself.
No. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously a case can be made that I think most of the Tudor monarchs were not maybe what we would call nice people, but I think definitely Elizabeth has won the day, but because of the course that the country took. But as I'm sure you're aware, there is so much. I mean, Valerie, who is listening to the call, is one of the individuals doing this, but so much recent work done on Mary I, redressing her reputation and providing more of a balance, which is great. So
absolutely, yes, we've had some speakers this year on the legacy of Mary and the iconography of Mary as well, and addressing the balance. But there are still people online who write an awful lot of stuff that you just think this is utterly biased and actually not objective at all. It's swayed by emotions and feelings and various other things, or whatever angle they particularly got. But I suppose that's true of historians to a certain extent. Opinions come into it, and sometimes emotions, various other things. You can't be entirely independent of all that, because it's just not really possible. I don't know if we've got any more questions in the chat box at all.
Yeah, we've got two more. So yeah, shall I just address them in
yes,
turn?
I can't see the box, unfortunately.
So the first one's from William. Thanks for all the questions, by the way. What sparked your interest in this topic? That is a very good question. I'm not 100% sure where the interest with Katherine Grey in particular came from. I think aside from the fact that, maybe as cliched as it sounds, I've always found, that there were so many tragic royal women in the Tudor periods. So having written about, Katherine Howard previously, who was one of them, and I think I've been fascinated by the Greys, for a very long time, first with Jane and then with her sisters. And I think because, as Tim, sorry, you were saying, as when we look at Catherine's life, this applies to all three of the Grey sisters. They all had very tragic lives when you think about it. But I think while that is often emphasised, and this kind of leads on to the other question that's been asked, which I'll come to, I think Katherine is kind of remembered as a romantic figure, a tragic figure, because of her marriage with Edward Seymour. And I felt that, while Mary, Queen of Scots' claim to the English throne is very well known, especially because her son obviously inherited the throne when Elizabeth died, that there was another story that kind of I think tends to get neglected, a bit marginalised at times, that, you know, Catherine was in many respects one of the leading contenders to inherit the throne. And, you know, it's really a question of how far her own actions perhaps changed the course of history potentially. I don't think there's necessarily a sense that Elizabeth would have recognised her as her successor, but obviously her clandestine marriage put her out of the running completely. So I think with Catherine, it was really wanting to emphasise her dynastic and political significance, which I think tends to be marginalised in favour of, understandably, a very romantic, tragic story. But, you know, if Elizabeth had followed her father's wishes, then it would have been Catherine's son who would have inherited the throne. And I think potentially the course of British history would have been very different. You know, it's hard to say, but, you know, it was a momentous decision not to follow Henry VIII's last will and testament, which was legally binding, and instead nominate the Scottish line, which Henry had barred from the succession. So it was really this kind of, you know, dynastic importance that I really wanted to get behind, a feeling that there was kind of a bigger story to tell, if that makes sense. And the next question, which is from Rebecca, which again, very interesting. Was Catherine's marriage a love match or for dynastic reasons? She risked her claim to the throne as her marriage was against the law. Again, very interesting question. I think because this is again something I try and address in this book. There's a tendency to stereotype a lot of figures in this era, and I think Catherine does tend to be stereotyped. So all three of the Grey sisters, Jane is obviously remembered as the very studious, scholarly, devoutly Protestant sister who, you know, was claimed as a Protestant martyr when she was beheaded. Mary Grey, the youngest, is kind of remembered as this dwarf who probably suffered from some kind of physical disability. And Catherine, the middle sister, is regarded as the most beautiful sister, but also frivolous, no real scholarly aptitude and no interest in religion. And while there's maybe some truth in that, I also wanted to challenge the belief that she was, you know, that she was only this frivolous figure who, you know, thought with her heart, not her head, and, you know, took a massive risk in marrying without Elizabeth's permission, because there's been a lot of novels written about Catherine and her sisters, the most recent being Philippa Gregory, The Last Tudor. And I think it's fair to say, from what other reviewers have said, and having read a few of her books myself, that she's no fan of Elizabeth. And so in that novel does not come across particularly well. And all three Grey sisters are victimised by her and by Mary I with regard to Jane to an extent. But as I try and get across in the book, while it's, you know, easy to fall into this trap of seeing Elizabeth as a very vindictive figure who hated her Grey cousins, technically Catherine and Hertford did break the law. As I said, the Treason Act of 1536 had made it a treasonable offence to marry without royal permission. And that very year, Henry VIII had imprisoned one of his other nieces, Lady Margaret Douglas, when she was suspected to have been engaged to Lord Thomas Howard. And as we know with Henry VIII, he was not afraid to resort to, you know, the ultimate penalty. So Margaret was arguably quite lucky that she was restored to favour eventually. So I think with Catherine, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, sorry, this is a bit of a roundabout answer. I think there is a bit of a hint at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, if the imperial ambassador is to be believed, that she may have had some ambitions for the throne. She was very resentful that Elizabeth, in her opinion, did not recognise her status. She did not permit her to reside in the Privy Chamber, which was a mark of royal favour, and Mary I had allowed Catherine and her mother, Frances Brandon, to do so. Elizabeth said that Elizabeth permitted her only to serve in the presence chamber, which was effectively a snub. So I think there is a sense that Catherine did want to be recognised, her claim to the throne, but, you know, maybe it was as simple as the fact that she did fall head over heels in love with Edward Seymour. You know, as young people do, they fell in love, took a massive risk, and ultimately paid the ultimate price. As I said, they never saw one another again when they were released from the Tower. They were both placed under separate house arrests. And as I said, Catherine's mental health did deteriorate and died by the standards of the day at a very young age. So I think it's a question of whether she felt it was worth the risk. So yeah, if that answers the question. But as I've mentioned briefly in the talk, the Imperial Ambassador Guzman de Silva, according to his reports, both Catherine and Hertford were recognised by kind of around 1566 as possessing a very jointly strong claim to the throne, especially because Catherine by then had two sons who could continue the Protestant line of succession. So I think there is a bit of a sense that Hertford himself may have had dynastic ambitions, but whether he courted and married Catherine because of his ambitions in that regard, I think again is a bit ambiguous. But there's no doubt in my mind that both strongly loved each other, and they lie at Salisbury Cathedral, and Hertford subsequently remarried. He had two other wives, but it's Catherine by whom he lies with in eternity, and they have a very elaborate monument at Salisbury Cathedral that their grandson William Seymour, Duke of Somerset, had constructed for them during the 1640s, Catherine having originally been interred in Suffolk where she had died. So I think it was very much a love match, but both paid a severe price for doing so, if that answers the question.
It seems to me resentment seems to be a sort of a recurring theme, really, sort of a lot of resentment between the parties there, because probably Catherine was resentful of the way she was treated by Elizabeth as opposed to Mary. Elizabeth was probably resentful about Catherine for some whatever reason. But Catherine, of course, made a foolish decision to break the law, and the law was, as you say, very clear. So what induced her to do so when she knew it was treasonous, and the penalty for treason could have been death, I mean, or certainly imprisonment. But also Mary Queen of Scots made very silly decisions, you know, with the Dudley and Boswell matters and so on. And you know, any sort of claim to the English throne was going to really inflame the mind completely. I mean, it just seems to be people jockeying for position and power, but at the time, if you had ambitions, you'd better watch out, because you had to be, you know, there had to be the right sort of ambitions, and you had to know the right sort of people, because otherwise it all is going to blow up in your face, sort of thing, which is what it appears to have done in this case. Yeah, it's really interesting. For those who are interested, Tracy Borman did do a program called Inside the Tower of London, episode 3, on Channel 5. I think it was a while ago, and there was a part there about Lady Katherine Grey, I believe. So if anybody's interested in following that up, anyway. Well, that was really interesting. Anyway, I think is that all the questions? Anyway, I presume that's the end of the questions. So,
I think so. Yeah, I don't think any others have come
excellent.
through.
Well, we have talked for an hour, so that's quite a considerable amount of time. We'll probably need a glass of water after that. So well done, very, very well done. There's some interesting things there, filling in some interesting facts and things, and a lot of things that many of us probably didn't actually know or didn't know very well. And point out, so some fascinating research there. You've obviously done your homework there, really dug deep into the lives of these people and their experiences and attitudes and various other things, and the original sources. So you've read the original letters, obviously, and that sort of thing.
Yes,
must be very interesting. Whereabouts are some of these sources kept, just as a matter of interest?
I mean, they tend to be held in all the major archives, so the National Archives being one, but a lot of them are held in the British Library. And as I said earlier, this kind of correspondence between Catherine, her uncle, and Cecil, we have all of their letters. And I personally loved reading Catherine's letters because her writing was, you know, it was almost like modern writing. So it was, very interesting.
Was it relatively easy to read, or was it some of them are?
I mean, hers was, whereas her uncle, Lord John Grey, his was almost indecipherable. So that was, so a real contrast between the two.
And of course, the spellings were not phonetic and not standard.
Exactly.
So that sometimes adds to the complication of trying to read them and understand what it was that they were meaning. And also the meanings of words have changed as well over the years. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to kind of figure out exactly what And of course, the punctuation rules were completely different as well, because they didn't really have the same punctuation rules. As often we can tell people's meaning from punctuation, but if there's no punctuation that's standard, it's much more difficult to know exactly what the meaning. Anyway, that was really interesting, fascinating. So thank you very much again for doing a talk for us.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's really enjoyable. Thank you.
No problem. And I hope people will buy the book. Available from all good booksellers, I guess.
It is, yeah.
Yes. So any online ones or actual real bookstores and whatever. So I'm sure people will be rushing out to buy it now, tomorrow. The sales will spike this week.
Fingers crossed.
Anyway, yes. Well, good luck with your PhD as well and your research.
Thank you.
So, well done.
Well, thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye then.
Thank you. Bye.